On the 10-year anniversary, we look back at the Kings' second Stanley Cup title. That's next in this edition of Locked On LA Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily podcast on the Los Angeles Kings. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, Kings fans, welcome to Locked On LA Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On LA Kings your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love for you to leave us a positive comment on Apple Podcasts if you're a fan of the show. And we're on YouTube. Please like and subscribe if you're enjoying this content. I'm Eddie Garcia, your host of Locked On LA Kings. I've worked in sports media for the past 30 years, 20 plus years at the Fox Sports Radio Network. Also co-host of the Puck Podcast, a weekly NHL review show that's been putting out content for the past 17 years, and a passionate LA Kings fan for over 30 years. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Before we get into another look back on Kings history, there is a bit of Kings news to share with you. The San Jose Sharks were the last team to fill their head coaching vacancy, and they did that with what the Kings did. They were promoted their coach, their assistant coach, to the head coaching job. His name is Ryan Warsofsky. And unlike Jim Hiller, he did not have any on-the-job training. He was not the interim coach before taking over as head coach, but he was an assistant coach for the Sharks and promoted to take over as the head coach. So what does this matter to the LA Kings? Well, Marco Sturm was a candidate for the Sharks head coaching vacancy. With him not being hired for the job, that means he will remain as the Ontario Reign head coach, the Kings AHL affiliate, and I'm sure the Kings are happy to be keeping Marco Sturm around. One other quick note, the Ontario Reign defenseman and big-time Kings prospect Brandt Clark was named to the AHL's top prospects team. We should be seeing Brandt with an LA Kings jersey on come next season. So just a couple of notes to pass along. But today, we had on Tuesday's show our 12-year anniversary look back at the Kings' first Stanley Cup winning team. Wednesday, we had former Kings assistant general manager Mike Futa on to talk about his memories of both the 2012 and 2014 Stanley Cup winning teams that he helped to construct. But today, on Thursday, it is the 10-year anniversary of the Kings' second Stanley Cup title. We're going to get into that and share some memories about that, tell you about the way that championship took place. Actually, my favorite of the two Kings LA titles, and I'll explain why as we go along. And while there were some going into the 2011-12 season who thought the Kings might be a Stanley Cup contender, I wasn't really one of them. And considering that the Kings were an 8th seed going into the playoffs, I really didn't think they were going to win the Stanley Cup when they started the playoffs either. But that wasn't the case going into the 2013-14 season. Now, LA was just 2 years removed from winning it all. They had pretty much the same roster coming back. The core was certainly still intact. And they were coming off a season before, a lockout-shortened season, but they did go to the conference finals the season before, and they were eliminated by the eventual Stanley Cup champion Chicago Blackhawks. That said, the Kings were good, but not great during that regular season. They would record 100 points, had a record of 46, 28, and 8, finished third place in the Pacific Division behind the Anaheim Ducks and San Jose Sharks, and 6th place in the conference. The expectations were that the Kings were more built for the playoffs, that they had the experience, and that they could make some noise in the postseason. However, that went away pretty fast in the first round against the Sharks as the Kings lost the first 2 games by a combined score of 6-3 and 7-2. Those were both road games. Remember, in 2012, the Kings won the first 3 games of every playoff series they were in, and they were 10-1 on the road. The Kings had played 2 road games in the 2014 postseason, and they lost both of them. So the Kings obviously were looking to get a big Game 3 victory, and although they played much better on home ice in that Game 3, they lost that one too, 4-3 in overtime, and were suddenly down 3-0 and looking at a sweep out of the first round of the playoffs, which should have been a huge disappointment. Now, only 3 teams at that point in NHL history had rallied down 3-0 to win a playoff series. And for some context, it had only happened once in the other major North American sports as well, That was the Red Sox rallying down 3-0 to beat the Yankees in baseball. It had never happened before and still has never happened in the NBA, where, if you're paying attention, the Boston Celtics have a 3-0 series lead over the Dallas Mavericks. Now, game 4, the Kings obviously had to win to stay alive, and they would do just that with a 6-3 victory, thanks to a pair of goals from Justin Williams and a pair of goals from trade deadline pickup Marian Gaborik. So the Kings were still alive. Game 5 back in San Jose, Jonathan Quick would come up big with a 30-save shutout. Kings win it 3-0 and are now headed back home, still alive. In LA, in game number 6, the Kings roll to a 4-1 win behind a pair of goals from Anze Kopitar, and suddenly they have set up a winner-take-all game 7 back in San Jose. And I remember being extremely confident going into that game 7 that the Kings were going to do it. They were going to be the 4th team in NHL history, the 5th team in all the major North American sports teams to rally down 3-0 to win a 7-game playoff series. In that game 7, the Kings actually fell behind 1-0 in the second period, but they got goals from Drew Doughty, Tyler Toffoli, and Anze Kopitar, sealed it with a couple of empty net goals, and the Kings win game 7 in San Jose 5-1. My wife was a teacher, and one of her students was the younger sister of San Jose Sharks forward and Long Beach native Matt Nieto. And I got a chance to talk to Matt that offseason, and I asked him, how did it feel for the Sharks going into game 7? And he admitted they were tight. They were too worried about not losing rather than focusing on winning. So just like in 2012, when the Kings won in the first round against the President's Trophy winners, this time they win in the first round, rallying down 3-0, and it felt like, in a sense, the pressure was off, that they were almost playing with house money, that they probably shouldn't have still been in the playoffs, but here they were going on to round number 2. And in round number 2, it would be a first ever meeting in the Stanley Cup playoffs against the Kings' Southern California rival. We'll get into that next here on Locked On LA Kings, your team every day. Hey, I need to tell you about Gametime. It takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. I just purchased tickets to see my alma mater, Fresno State, play college football this coming season at UCLA in the Rose Bowl, and I purchased the tickets with Gametime. The app is super easy to use and navigate. Just go on, tap on the listings, sports, music, shows, and they will list the tickets with the best deals. And it is easy to search for tickets for teams and events. You can find the lowest price guaranteed, or they will credit you 110% of the difference. Right now, you can get Dodgers tickets for $42 for tonight's game against the Rangers. You can get Angels tickets for $1. That's my wife's an Angels fan. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets to all events. Just download the Gametime app, which I have obviously done. Create an account and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Well, it was on to round number 2 of the 2014 Stanley Cup playoffs for the LA Kings, and they would face, for the first time ever, their rivals in Southern California. Of course, that would be the Anaheim Ducks, and it had never happened before. So obviously it was a very exciting time for hockey in Southern California to finally see these two teams square off. And look, I have a good friend, Doug the Ducks fan, who was very pleased that the Anaheim Ducks were the first team in the state of California to win a Stanley Cup, even though they had not been around nearly as long as the LA Kings, an original expansion franchise. And that did stick in the craw of a lot of LA Kings fans that the Ducks were the first team to win a Stanley Cup. But it felt like this could be a great opportunity, not only to keep Stanley Cup hopes alive for this season, but to get some revenge of sorts against the Ducks, to win the first ever playoff matchup between these two teams and get bragging rights in that sense. And that was what was on the line in this series. So things did get off to a very good start for the LA Kings in this series. They won game 1, 3-2 in overtime behind Marian Gaborik. He tied it in the third period and then won it in overtime. Game 2, the Kings posted a 3-1 win behind a 36-save performance from Jonathan Quick and had a 2-0 series lead, having won both games in Anaheim. And suddenly, after losing 3 straight games to open the playoffs, the Kings were now riding a 6-game winning streak. But those Quackers would not go down quietly. They would flip the script and take the 2 games in LA, and suddenly it was tied at 2 games apiece and was a best-of-3 series. So back in Anaheim for game number 5, and LA would drop a tough 4-3 game and suddenly find themselves once again in an elimination situation in a game number 6. But back on home ice, the Kings would win 2-1, getting unlikely goals from Jake Muzzin and Trevor Lewis. And it would be a second straight game 7 on the road for the LA Kings. So back in Anaheim, winner take all. And the Kings roll 6-2 win. They jumped out to a 3-0 lead after the first period. They had a 5-0 lead in the second period. Marian Gaborik scored his 9th of the playoffs. And the Kings were on to the conference finals. I was there at Honda Center to witness this game 7, sitting in the auxiliary press box with my friend Doug, and loving every second of it. Sorry, Doug. Not only did the Kings now have bragging rights over the Ducks, but they did send Ducks future Hall of Famer Teemu Selanne off into retirement on a losing note. I do remember very classy moment after the handshake line. Obviously, the Ducks fans gave Teemu Selanne the Finnish flash, a standing ovation, sending him off. I know he was very disappointed, obviously. And I know the Kings players stuck around and gave him the stick tap on the ice, showing respect for one of the classiest guys that ever played in the NHL. I can truly say, even though I hate the Ducks, I did not hate Teemu Selanne. That guy was a great player, seemed like a great guy, and went out on that note, which was a little bit sweet for Kings fans, for being honest. But that was a classy moment in that Game 7 victory for the Kings over the Ducks. So it was on to the conference finals and a showdown with the defending Stanley Cup champion Chicago Blackhawks, the team that eliminated the Kings in the conference finals in 5 games the season before. And with all due respect to the teams in the East, that season, it felt like this was the de facto Stanley Cup final. It felt like these were the best 2 teams still playing. They had both recently won Stanley Cups, both playing at a high level. And it just, again, it felt like this was kind of the real Stanley Cup final. It felt like whoever won this series was going to win the cup. Well, the 2 teams would split the first 2 games in Chicago, but the Kings would win both games 3 and 4 on home ice, and suddenly were 1 win away from advancing to the Stanley Cup final. But the Blackhawks, showing the heart of a champion, would not go down that easily. They would storm back to win games 5 and 6 and set up a 3rd straight winner-take-all Game 7 for the LA Kings, once again on the road. As for that Game 7, wild start to this one. 5 goals scored in the opening period. Chicago had 3 of them. LA had 2. In the second period, the Kings would trade goals with the Blackhawks. But then in the third period, only 1 goal was scored. It would be Marian Gaborik's 12th of the playoffs. We were tied 4-4 going into sudden death of the Western Conference Finals in that Game 7 in Chicago. And I have said this before. If you watch this channel, listen to this show, I've said the most stress I have ever felt in my life watching a sporting event was that overtime Game 7 against the Blackhawks. And this is not a humble brag, but I would point out that I actually have been to a Super Bowl and I saw my favorite team win in the final seconds. And that was not as stressful as this game, because this was different. You were literally hanging on every shot, because at any moment, any shot could go in and that would be it. You would either win or you would lose. So the stress of that was very memorable. I remember literally having stomach pains watching that game because I was so stressed out. My wife was so stressed out, she couldn't even watch it. She went in the bedroom and just waited to hear my reaction, either cheering or probably cursing at whatever was going to happen. Well, fortunately, our agony didn't last too long, because Kings defenseman Alec Martinez put a fairly harmless shot on net. It deflected off one of the Chicago Blackhawks and fluttered into the net past their goaltender, Corey Crawford, and the game was over. I jumped off my couch in celebration, screaming. My wife came running in from the other room and jumped in my arms, and we were jumping around and I could not stop laughing. I was so happy, and we just sat there and watched the replay over and over. I remember Drew Doughty was on the bench, and he jumped up and he like fell onto the ice over the boards. It was just an amazing moment, one of my favorite moments ever as a Kings fan. So the Kings win it in overtime on the road against the defending Stanley Cup champs, and they were going back to the Stanley Cup final, having won 3 consecutive Game 7s all on the road. We are going to talk about that Stanley Cup final against the New York Rangers. That's next here on Locked On LA Kings, your team every day. Hey, Locked On Kings fans, I want to tell you about something. It is a fun mobile game, and it's called Ultimate Hockey GM. Ever dreamed of becoming an NHL GM and managing a hockey franchise? Do you think you could run the Kings better than current GM Rob Blake? Well, your dream can come true, and this game is most definitely for you. Manage every strategic aspect of trading players and drafting players, navigate through free agency, all in a challenging and realistic game world. As a Kings fan, you know there is no offseason. GMs are constantly making moves at every point of the year to improve their team's chances, and that is why I think you're going to love this game. Ultimate Hockey GM is completely free and playable offline. Play on the go as you want, when you want, and Locked On listeners get 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On NHL in the game store. So make sure to check it out. Download the game. Just visit hockeygm.app, hockeygm.app, app, or look it up in the app stores. Ultimate Hockey GM. Start your dynasty today. Well, for the second time in 3 years, the LA Kings were back in the Stanley Cup final. And with all due respect to the New Jersey Devils, who certainly have won more championships recently than the New York Rangers, this series did feel a little bit bigger because it was LA versus New York. It was the Kings taking on an original 6 franchise, playing games at Madison Square Garden. It felt a little bit bigger, with all due respect. Now, that said, I know I felt pretty confident about the Kings winning this series. Like I said, it really did feel like at the time the winner of the Kings Blackhawks series was going to go on to win the Stanley Cup, but you still have to get the job done. And the New York Rangers certainly were a formidable opponent. That said, the Kings had a slightly better regular season record than the Rangers, and so that meant the Kings actually did finally have home ice advantage in a series for the first time in their 2 Stanley Cup playoff runs. And the Kings were able to take advantage of that. They were able to take a 2-0 series lead in this one, winning both games on home ice. They took the first game 3-2 in overtime. Justin Williams scored the game winner in OT, and then LA rallied down 2-0, or they rallied down 2-0 in that game with 3 straight goals to win that game 1. And game 2 would go down much the same way. This time, though, double overtime. The Kings get the 4-3 win. Dustin Brown scores the game winner. And again, the Kings, like in game 1, fell behind 2-0, had to rally back. They got third period goals from Marian Gaborik and Dwight King to force the overtime, and then Dustin Brown with the overtime game winner. So the Kings certainly looking like 3 straight overtime wins, certainly overtime clutch goals. The Kings were coming up big, and it certainly looked like the Kings were obviously in a great position to win a second Stanley Cup. And then they go on the road into New York. Jonathan Quick puts on a show, 32 save shutout in a Kings 3-0 win. And suddenly the LA Kings are on the verge of a Stanley Cup final sweep. Well, that did not happen. The Rangers did get a 2-1 win on home ice to send the series back to Los Angeles for a game 5. But to be honest, I wasn't all that disappointed about it, because while I certainly was not rooting for the Kings to lose game 4, I was happy to get a chance to go to game 5 and witness, hopefully, the Kings for the second time winning a Stanley Cup. On to that game number 5 in Los Angeles. And unlike the series clincher against the Devils, the Kings didn't just cruise to a lopsided win where the fans had no stress and we basically just celebrated the entire third period. No, this one would be decided in double overtime, and this is my ringtone on my phone.
Martinez to Clifford, feeds it right side to Foley with a shot, save, rebound, score! Alec Martinez has won the Stanley Cup for the Los Los Angeles Kings.
The great Nick Nixon on the call. And like I said, every time I get a phone call and I hear that, it never gets old, believe it or not. Maybe I'm weird, but I love hearing that every time. And I'm not embarrassed if I'm in the grocery store and suddenly that I hear Nick Nixon in my pocket. Doesn't matter. I'm still happy about it. But Alec Martinez scores his second series clinching goal in sudden death, and the Kings were Stanley Cup champions for a second time. I remember obviously getting a chance to be there again, feeling so lucky that I got to see this, and obviously so happy. The Kings winning for a second time in 3 years. For me, I remember thinking honestly that this felt like validation. Some thought maybe the Kings were one of those teams. They just got hot at the right time in 2012, but to win a second cup in 3 years, it meant the Kings were legit. They were a great team. You win 2 cups in 3 years, that's a serious accomplishment. And this time, if you remember the story from 2012 when I was in the radio booth behind Nick Nixon and I didn't really show much emotion, this time I did get a chance to celebrate. We were sitting in the auxiliary press box or press area, which basically is they just reserve a group of seats for the overflow of media that's there from everywhere. And being a radio guy and a podcaster, we were sitting out in the seats, which I loved. It was great because you were just out there with the crowd, and so you could basically act like a fan and just have fun and celebrate, which is what I did. I did not host Kings Talk after the second Stanley Cup win, so that meant I got to go down on the ice after the game and interview players and take pictures, which was an amazing thrill. And I didn't know it at the time, but I would also get to do something else that was pretty cool because of my job. It would turn out that AM 570, our local Fox Sports Radio affiliate in Los Angeles, was going to cover the Kings victory parade. And so they asked me if I would like to be on one of the buses with the players and during the parade and report as let's go to our guy, Eddie Garcia, who's on one of the buses, and kind of give the feel of what it was like to drive through the fans and the crowd and be with all the players, which I was like, yeah, I'll do that. So to get a chance to be, again, a part of kind of the Kings celebration like that was really, really cool. And again, just so lucky to get a chance to do something like that was a big thrill. And then to be in the arena for the victory celebration afterwards and get to cover that as well. And again, getting to do all this stuff for free, a huge thrill for me personally. As a Kings fan, to be able to get to do that was absolutely awesome. So I talked about it. I felt like for me, the second Stanley Cup title was actually my favorite of the two. And I know sometimes people are surprised when I say that, because you always think the first time's your favorite because you never know if you're ever going to win it. And to finally get that monkey off your back, I totally get that. And it was very special, obviously. But the way the Kings won this one, the comeback down 3-0 against San Jose, beating the Ducks head-to-head in the first ever playoff series against Anaheim, and then beating the defending Stanley Cup champs in a Game 7, in overtime, all those Game 7s. I just thought it was amazing. I thought the second time around was even better, even sweeter, and I love both of them, believe me, but 2014 was a special season for me as a Kings fan, and just really loved it. Justin Williams was the Conn Smythe Trophy winner, his playoff MVP in 2014. Could have easily gone to Marian Gaborik. What a great pickup he was for the LA Kings. He scored 14 goals in the playoffs for the LA Kings. It was an amazing run for the LA Kings to win that second Stanley Cup title, and it happened 10 years ago today. And I was so happy I found if you're watching on YouTube, I found my Stanley Cup championship hat from that year. I didn't know where it was. I knew where the 2012 one was, but I was so happy. I went into my closet and I dug around, and sure enough, there it was. I found it. So I'm happy to get to wear that today on this 10-year anniversary. Well, hope you enjoyed that trip down memory lane. Hope you enjoyed our look back at both the 2012 and 2014 Stanley Cup winning teams. This week, we are going to get more back into the here and now for the LA Kings coming up next week. But for you everydayers, those of you that listen and watch Locked On LA Kings every day, Friday is our usual Kings Fan Feedback Show, your thoughts on anything involving the LA Kings. I talked about early on this week the holes that the Kings are looking to fill in their lineup potentially going into next season. If you have any thoughts on that, feel free to share them. And of course, if you have any Stanley Cup memories you want to share as well from 2012 or 2014, you can send an email for tomorrow's show. The email address is lockedoneddie@gmail.com, EDDIE. And you can always leave your comments if you're watching on YouTube in the comments section. Section helps out the algorithm, helps people find the show, and we really appreciate that. Also, would love you to stay interactive with the show on social media, X, Twitter, Instagram. We are at Locked On LA Kings. Thanks for listening and watching this episode of Locked On LA Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Have a great rest of your day. We'll talk to you on Friday. And as always, go Kings, go.